Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's been a busy year in the celebrations and in the events commemorating 50 years of diplomatic relations between Germany and Israel. And I can see quite a number of faces in the audience for which this is not the first conference or the first event on these relations. But I think German-Israeli relations are sometimes like wine. The more the time passes, the more you deal with it, it becomes better, especially when you think about drinking it in the future.
If the wine is good.
If the wine is good, yes. It's not always good, but it is good. And thank you to Jürgen, who gave such an excellent paper, providing a very wide overview within half an hour on actually, 67 years of sometimes quite turbulent and quite difficult relations. I will try to focus on a narrower field and talk about the defense relations between West Germany and Israel, and deal with one example which I think is very illustrative of the form and the type of activities that were undertaken, but also not just activities, but the people behind them. Because for us, especially for the younger generations, if I look at students in this university or younger people on the street, the good friendship, the close relations between Germany and Israel are a given. They're absolutely a given. Israelis travel to Berlin without even giving it a second thought. Israeli students, especially also from our university, go abroad to German universities. We have quite a large contingent of German researchers coming to Bar Ilan and other universities. Many of us drive German cars. Those of us who can afford German cars can be quite proud of it. It's complete normality. The Israeli Chief of Staff, the Army Chief of Staff, is being driven around in German cars, and nobody says a word. But actually the opposite, in my opinion, is correct. It's quite wondering, it's quite, I would say, even a miracle that only such a short time, just a couple of generations after the Holocaust and the Second World War and the destruction by Germans of a third of the entire Jewish people in the world, that relations are so close. If we look at other comparable issues, and there is nothing comparable that I can think of, perhaps the only close comparison that one could make is the Armenian genocide by the Turks during the First World War. You will never find any Turkish-Armenian relations to such an extent today. And we know that these are very, very problematic relations, even today, the way that the official Turkey treats or avoids dealing with the Holocaust of the Armenians, and from the other side. And it's interesting how history simply evolves around in circles, especially in our region. When we look at the shooting down of a Russian military aircraft yesterday by Turkey and European concerns over what it could bring, this certainly takes us back to the years of the Cold War and the type of thinking that typified the Cold War, and that's where I want to start. I want to talk about German-Israeli military, technological and intelligence cooperation, but let's remember that the starting years were very difficult. When Germany lost the Second World War in the summer of 1945, many of the soldiers and many of the officials of the Nazi Party and many of the criminals, the war criminals of the Nazi regime, simply changed their clothes. They threw away their uniform, they wore civilian clothes, and they went back home and they continued on with their lives. And so did many of the officials of various ministries, and later on also people who were active in the armed forces and in West Germany's intelligence services. So did Germany suddenly stop being anti-Semitic on the 20th of April 1945 and suddenly became the lovers of Jews and later of Israel? Well, obviously not. So as a political scientist, I have to look for the motivation, for the interests that were driving the early decades of German-Israeli cooperation. If it's on the one part was trying to console between people, but again, as politics and political science says, it's all about interests. So in my research, I was trying to delve deeper into the hardcore realpolitik interests of both countries to create cooperation beyond the social and societal aspect of overcoming the legacy, the terrible legacy of the Holocaust and the Nazi regime. And much of it, in my opinion, centers around the issue of security, military, and intelligence. We should remember that the Federal Republic of Germany and the State of Israel were born at the same time, almost at the same time. Israel in 48, the Federal Republic in 49. And from the date of their birth, were confronted with serious and deep security concerns and threats. Israel was threatened by its immediate neighbors on all sides and did not find political acceptance in our region for decades. West Germany was also given birth into the Cold War with enemies on its very borders, with its territory sliced up into two parts, West Germany and East Germany, and with a tremendous amount of Soviet forces being stationed in East Germany and in the Warsaw Pact countries. That made the possibility of war very imminent, certainly in the minds of people in those generations. And therefore, the first and foremost concern of Israeli political decision makers and of West German political decision makers of the time was the issue of security. Everything else was secondary. And this lasted well into the 1970s, in Israel certainly until the Yom Kippur War, and perhaps well afterwards, in the context of the Cold War and in the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict. And so when here we talk about 50 years of Israeli-German relations, we talk about the official relations, which began in 1965 with official diplomatic relations. But when I talk about security cooperation, in fact, one should really celebrate or commemorate more than 60 years of cooperation, which goes back all the way to 1955, 1956, and the context of the Suez War in the Middle East, in which Israel, France, and Britain cooperated over the security problem in the Sinai. And the German intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or we say the BND, which was founded a year earlier, became interested in cooperating with the Israeli Mossad after the Israeli success in the Suez War. If we look at the military history of the Suez War, Israel, which was a very small and weak country, succeeded in taking over the Sinai from Egypt, whereas the two then world powers of Britain and France militarily failed miserably to take over the Suez Canal, and also due to American and Soviet pressure, did not get beyond Port Said and the outskirts of the canal. This made a great influence or great impact on German intelligence and strategic thinkers of the time, especially in the intelligence service, which was making its first steps in the international scene. The BND was a new creation. It was created almost single-handed by a person called General Reinhard Gehlen, who was, during the Second World War, the chief of the German army's intelligence in the Eastern Front. General Gehlen was perhaps better placed than anybody else already early in the war, around 1943, to understand that there was no way Germany could beat the Soviet Union militarily. And being a very astute, clever person, he was already thinking about the future, what would he and his people do after the end of the war. He was able, towards the end of the war, to take his vast archives and hide them in Bavaria, and immediately upon surrender to the American forces at the end of the war, he offered the Americans his good services with information about the Soviet Union. Now, the Americans at the time were, of course, allied with the Russians during the war. American military intelligence had very little information about the Soviet Union. They welcomed him with open arms, brought him into America with his top officers, and during the following 6 years, basically funded a semi-private intelligence organization headed by Gehlen, which was called Organisation Gehlen, active in near Munich, in Pullach, and active behind the Iron Curtain in collecting information on East Germany and the Warsaw Pact countries. By 1955, this could not really go on, the existence of a semi-private, uncontrolled, and perhaps uncontrollable intelligence services on German soil. And after a lot of hand-wringing, the Organisation Gehlen became the official German Federal Intelligence Service, BND, which it is until today. And part of it still sits in Pullach to the south of Munich, and more recently, part of it moved to Berlin. General Gehlen was trying to create, I just heard the word corporate identity this morning. He was trying to create an independent intelligence service which would serve the newly founded Federal Republic of Germany, wanted to get away from the dependency on the CIA, on the Americans, and looked for partners all over the world to cooperate in intelligence. He couldn't work very well with the French. A lot of the French senior officers of French intelligence at the time were coming from a background of the resistance, of the maquis, of the people who were fighting the Germans during the Second World War, and still felt a great animosity towards German. He had a problem with the British because the British were at the time, late 50s, early 60s, in the throes of decolonization, and Germany was economically fighting for new markets in these newly independent states. Gehlen, at the time, although no great lover of Jews or Israel, was very impressed by Israel's military success in 1956, which was based on very precise, very thorough intelligence. And therefore he initiated early contacts to the Mossad and offered the Mossad cooperation worldwide in the field of intelligence. It's interesting to note that there was no German embassy, obviously, in Israel at the time, but Israel had a representation in Germany, not in Bonn, so that it wouldn't have the character of an embassy. It had an office in Cologne, the Israeli mission in Cologne, in order to facilitate the economic cooperation through the reparations agreement in purchasing material and goods in Germany for Israel. And Gehlen sent one of his confidants to create early connections to the Mossad. Now, I should mention that a lot of the people in the Mossad at that time either came from Germany, Austria, or had their origins in countries which were occupied by the Nazis. Many had lost their families in the Holocaust, and it's very difficult for us, I think, to imagine the thought of these people receiving an offer for cooperation from Hitler's former chief of intelligence on the Eastern Front, where most of the Jews were brutally murdered. But again, it's difficult for us to make these judgments. At the time, Israel was very small, was very weak. Its intelligence community was tremendously small and unsuitable for the requirements of a country surrounded by enemies. And the decision at the time, which was made by the head of Mossad, Issa Harel, but certainly made indirectly by the Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion, was to cooperate with German intelligence, even though they knew that many of these people were coming from the Nazi regime and had all sorts of shady pasts. I should mention that a lot of Nazis escaped to Pullach at the end of the war. This was one of the only German authorities where denazification was not thoroughly followed, and many former Nazis were sent by General Gehlen as BND representatives to Arab countries, where quite a number of them were welcomed especially because of their Nazi past and their hatred of Jews. To think of Mossad agents, Mossad officers, and BND officers at the time sitting together around one table must have been very difficult on an individual, personal level. And when we talk about friendship or animosity between countries, countries are a very large mechanism, but at the end of the day, it comes down to people. People have to find a way of understanding, a way of communication, and there have to be some common interests in order to work together. And the common interests were the constant security threats against both countries. Some of them emanating from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, had their forces in Eastern Germany and were also supplying huge amounts of Soviet weapons to Israel's enemies at the time. And one of the tasks of intelligence is to find out the type and the secrets of the weaponry of the enemy. This was very important for Israel to cooperate. And from 1956 onwards, and practically until today, Very close intelligence cooperation was developed between the BND and the Mossad, and later also between the German Armed Forces Intelligence and Amman, the Israeli Military Intelligence Division, and other organizations dealing with countering terrorism and so on. It moved in slow steps. The cooperation was quite incremental. It didn't happen overnight, and people didn't become friends overnight. In the first visit of the head of the Mossad, Issa Harel, to Germany in 1961, he came from Paris. Paris was the Mossad European headquarters at the time. It was a long drive in those days to Pullach with bad roads. I would have very much liked to be a fly on the wall in that meeting to see Issa Harel. Some of his family were killed in the Holocaust, coming to Pullach and sitting with Reinhard Gehlen, former Nazi intelligence chief in the Eastern Front, and not talking about the Holocaust or history or the Second World War, but talking about day-to-day intelligence work on how to cooperate over things like Egypt, Syria, East Germany, Poland, the Czechoslovakia, and so on. It was difficult, at least for Harel, was certainly difficult. When he told me about this visit, he told me his first impression when they arrived in Pullach was that it looked like a concentration camp with very high fences, high walls, guard dogs, guard towers. Certainly didn't add to the atmosphere. And he did not want to sleep on German soil. The meeting ended late, but he insisted that his people, that his officers, drive all the way back to Strasbourg in France to find a hotel for the night. I think it says something about the person. It says something about the strength of character and the ability of these people, not just the leaders of the organizations, but also the mid-level officials, heads of departments or heads of sections, which were able to cooperate with each other and try to look at the future, try to look at immediate threats and interests rather than delve in the past. The past was certainly there, always like a cloud, overshadowing everything you did. But people tried to overcome that through practical cooperation, through looking at the future. And I want to give an example, because of the limited time that I have, of one such cooperation venture, Operation Cerberus, which was a top secret German intelligence cooperation effort in the field of intelligence and military technologies, which started in the 1970s, and the fruits of it we still see even today. I want to say a few words about the technological background, and the key word is radars. Radar is a technology to discover objects from a distance through using radio waves. Radar, which was developed before the Second World War, today is so much part of our lives that we don't even notice it. Yet without radar, modern forms of life as we know it, and especially the ability to travel, would not exist. Radar is today responsible for the management of the sea and the air. And those who came on a flight yesterday could not have come here without radar, because there wouldn't be no management of aircraft in the world. Tens of thousands of flights each hour, tens of thousands of ships, and a lot of applications on land as well. Very civilian things. The radar sort of organizes the space in which we are living. These technologies are very important because it makes you able to see and to identify objects from very far away. But they're also dangerous because if the enemy can see you, he can hit you. And therefore radar is crucially important in military issues. And if you can disrupt, if you can jam the radar of the enemy, you make the enemy blind, and therefore your aircraft or your missiles can reach the enemy and he cannot harm you. Project Cerberus was about developing technologies to jam enemy radars, to make the radar of the enemy not able to see the target that they want. And I will ask ourselves a very simple question. In the Yom Kippur War, 1973, the Israeli Air Force was severely curtailed in its operations by Syrian and by Egyptian missiles. These were Russian missiles, of course, provided to the Arab countries. Israel lost a large number of aircraft despite valiant efforts by its pilots. They were not able to turn the tide in the first days of the war. And Israel has counted on air power, and was not able in the Yom Kippur War, certainly in its early days, to bring that air power to bear. The missile bent the wing of the plane, was said afterwards in Israeli military circles. And yet 9 years later, in the First Lebanon War of 1982, when Israeli planes attacked large Syrian missile formations in the Bekaa Valley and behind the Golan Heights, Israel was able in one day to destroy all of Syria's missile defenses without losing a single plane. And later in dogfights shot down more than 100 Syrian planes without the loss of a single Israeli plane. Something must have happened in those 9 years between 73 and 82. Now the pilots were the same pilots, and the planes were the same planes, and the missiles were the same missiles. So what happened that enabled the Israeli Air Force to overcome the disaster of 1973 so well that it achieved unbelievable results 9 years later against the same enemy, same planes, same pilots, same kind of training, and so on. So let me say a few words about the Cerberus project, and it's all about anti-aircraft missiles, because these were the main weapons used by the Arab armies, by the Egyptians and the Syrians to shoot down Israeli planes. This is just one example of a SAM-2 missile which was captured in Israel at the later stages of the Yom Kippur War. And the so-called SAM missiles, it is a series of anti-aircraft missiles, began to be developed by the Soviets already in the late 1950s. They were first shown in the 1960 May Parade in Moscow, and the West received information already in April 1961 by a high-ranking Soviet agent, Oleg Penkovsky, who was working for the CIA, and provided American intelligence with a lot of information about the capabilities and the type of construction of Soviet SAM missiles. In 1965, these missiles began to be provided to the Egyptians and were placed along the Suez Canal, onto which they became then a threat to Israeli air superiority. They did not play a major role in the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, which began with a large Israeli air attack which neutralized all the air forces of the Arab countries. The Arabs had a very small number of missiles and were not well trained in their use, but during the war of attrition in the early 1970s, and certainly by October 73, these missiles became the main threat to Israeli air superiority in the region, and therefore a major military threat against Israel. Israel was well aware of the capabilities, limitations, and threats of radar, and already in the second half of the 1960s began a very small program of so-called electronic warfare or electronic countermeasures to try and see if radar of the enemy could be disrupted, disturbed, could be made inaccurate. I should say that this was a small group of people which were in the beginning considered as total lunatics by the military establishment. Radar is a very powerful tool, and to think that you can develop with very few means a technology to foil this kind of radar, which the larger superpowers at the time could not do, sounded absolutely unbelievable, incredible, like space fiction. But this small group of people, which began in the Israeli Navy and later on in the Air Force, persisted and began to collect information about enemy radars, to measure the type of frequencies, the type of activities. I should mention the disaster, the sinking of the Israeli destroyer Eilat in October 1967 by Egyptian radar-guided missiles. And this naval disaster, the biggest Israeli naval disaster to date, brought home the threat, the depth of threat posed by radar, and therefore the necessity to develop technologies to foil enemy radar. In order to get more details about enemy radar, it's not enough to stand at a distance and record the wavelength or the type of pattern. I should mention that each radar has what is called a fingerprint. Each radar works differently. It works on different frequencies and a different type of technologies, and therefore you need to have more and more information if you want to understand and develop a countermeasure, a counter system against this kind of radar. It's not enough to stand 100 kilometers or 50 away from shore and try to record this. It's much better to have the actual radar literally on your desk. And in December 1961, Israeli commandos crossed at night into the Gulf of Suez and literally lifted from the Egyptians the most up-to-date radar station that the Egyptians received from the Soviets, the so-called P-12 radar. Was a very difficult operation because they didn't realize how heavy the actual radar was. The information that they received was slightly too light. The Israeli commandos raided the Egyptian radar station, having killed and drove off the defenders, had to lift the radar with a helicopter and fly back to Israel. Unfortunately, the radar was so heavy, the helicopter was about to crash, and the pilot already received orders on the radio to jettison the radar into the sea. Somehow he kept on flying, realizing that this was of crucial importance, and he was able to land in the south of Israel beyond the border. And Israeli intelligence, therefore, in 1969, not only had details about Soviet radars, but had the actual radar to work on and to try to develop countermeasures against it. And this information was very, very interesting for German B&D analysts who wanted to know what type of activity and what type of capabilities this radar had, because this was exactly the Soviet type of radar that was placed in several points along the German border and was monitoring the airwaves and the activities of the West German Air Force. During the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli Navy, which by that time was able to develop electronic countermeasures, deployed them very successfully. And in two major naval battles, there were heavy losses to enemy vessels without any loss to the Israeli Navy. The concept of electronic countermeasures was proven to be correct, was proven to be feasible. The Israeli electronic countermeasures were able to foil the radars of enemy missiles. Not one single missile hit an Israeli ship, while at the same time the Israeli missiles, the so-called Gabriel missiles, hit the enemy and sunk quite a number of Syrian and Egyptian ships. And so the military technology of jamming radar actively has proven to be correct. If it can work on a ship, it can work elsewhere. And therefore, the designers and the planners try to implement the same system for an aircraft. But there is a huge difference between installing a system on a ship, which is 80 to 90 meters long and has a lot of place and power, and you can use as much electricity as you want. You can place a huge antenna on top. A ship is very large and stable. It's a completely different story to build something, around the size of this, the span of my hand, to place it in an aircraft with very little electronic abilities and very little current, and the kind of current that you have perhaps in your lamp at home is the maximum what you can get out of an aircraft engine. It's completely different. It's not just a question of miniaturization. A system that you have on a ship could work for tens of kilometers. You have to have something effective on an aircraft. It was going to be a very difficult, very, very expensive project. And very early on, it became apparent to Israeli intelligence that Israel could not afford this kind of development by itself. Israel had to look for partners for the project. They did not want to cooperate with the United States because American military industries are always competing with the Israeli industries, and therefore they looked elsewhere. And the possibility of working together with Germany came up in the early 1970s because of a project that Germany was working on, which was the project of the Tornado. I'm just showing here the concept of jamming a missile. I don't want to get into the technologies, but you create artificial targets. Let's think of a radar as a pair of eyes. And if I look at an individual person, I can see him or her, and I can point my weapon at him. But if I place many, many mirrors around, and those who went to a circus and saw a house of mirrors know that you can easily duplicate a person, and through many mirrors you will see many, many people. This is the concept of jamming radar. You artificially create many, many targets which are not there. If you have one aircraft in the air, radar sees 10 or 15 or 20, doesn't know at which aircraft to shoot the missile, and therefore the probability of hitting the real aircraft is minimal. In the late 60s, early 70s, Germany, together with Italy and Britain, was developing a new fighter bomber aircraft called the Tornado. This was a gigantic development project. The Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, which recently died, called it the largest armament project since the birth of Christ. Certainly in budgets and in the technological scope, this was going to be the new central element in the European Army's NATO flexible response. This was to be a conventional and a nuclear bomber. And as the Americans said, one bomber has to get through. The Tornado, the new Tornado planes, in case of war in Europe, had to fly through a heavily defended area of East Germany, soaked with Soviet radars, missiles, and other anti-aircraft capabilities. And therefore it became crucial for Germany that the new Tornado is not only good, fast, and nuclear armed, but also has the capabilities to jam enemy radars. If you jam the radars, more bombers will get through. If more bombers get through, NATO's nuclear deterrence is reinforced. And this was the base for cooperation between Germany and Israel, which was conducted through the BND and the Mossad over the 1970s in order to develop the Cerberus system, a system for jamming enemy radars very successfully. You can see the Cerberus pod on the left side of the picture of the Tornado aircraft. It's that tiny little thing at the end. Compare that to the gigantic systems installed in ships, and we can see the technological success, but it wasn't only technology, it was based on very hard intelligence work. The project had different stages, had different generations, and is still being used by the Luftwaffe today as they fly over the Balkans, over Afghanistan, and so on. This is the most advanced system in the world to jam radars very successfully. But I want to talk a little bit for 1 or 2 minutes about the intelligence aspects of the cooperation, rather than the technology. In order to develop a system that will jam radars effectively during wartime, you need to know the right frequencies that the enemy will use at wartime. During peacetime and training, they use different frequencies. The real frequencies for wartime are never revealed. They are top secret. And so it doesn't matter what you know about radars today. If a war erupts, they will use completely different frequencies with other ways in which radars react. And therefore it became paramount for both Germans and Israelis to discover the frequencies of Soviet radars in wartime. But the Soviets were very careful. They instructed their radar officers and their allies never to switch on the real frequencies. So you have to create a situation which is close to war for them to switch on the real systems in order to identify these frequencies. And so the BND in the 1970s arranged for a Luftwaffe, for Bundeswehr aircraft to mistakenly penetrate for a few seconds East German airspace, hoping that the Soviets will switch on the real frequencies and immediately these could be captured by the BND listening stations. Yesterday, I think that the Turkish government said the Russian plane penetrated their airspace for 17 seconds. 17 seconds. That was obviously enough for the Turks to shoot down the Russian aircraft. So we have to think of the 1970s, a time of great tension in the Cold War. What could a problem or a mistake in such an operation cause if the Soviets in East Germany suddenly saw a West German plane penetrate their airspace? But they were careful. They either knew about the intentions of these operations, or for whatever reason, they never switched on their real frequencies. And this became a major problem for the project. And therefore, the BND, together with Israeli intelligence, established a network of radar listening stations around the Soviet Union, hoping to catch these frequencies. One was in the very northern tip of Germany in Husum. Another was in Lecce, the NATO air base in Italy. One was to the north of Tehran until 1979 during the Shah regime. And after the Khomeini revolution in Iran in 1979, when it was not possible to maintain a station in Iran anymore, it was moved together with Chinese intelligence to the Pamir Mountains in the south of the Soviet Union, hoping against hope that the kind of missile and radar troops which were stationed along the southern border of the Soviet Union were of a lower caliber than those stationed in Europe and may make a mistake. All you need is the enemy to make one mistake. They switch it on once, you have the frequencies. And indeed, it was possible in the south to identify the real frequencies which the Soviets used on the border in Outer Mongolia, on the border with China, and therefore to design the Cerberus system very effectively. And we know that in 1982, the activities of the Israeli Air Force in one day neutralized all of Syria's anti-aircraft missiles. This was as much a military disaster for the Soviet Union as it was for the Syrians. They suddenly realized that the billions and billions and the years that they have spent perfecting these missiles became completely useless because of one type of electronic system. And I should say that at the end of the day, it was people, Israelis and Germans cooperating together under very difficult circumstances that made this project possible. This is only one illustration, one example of people sitting together and trying to overcome the historical past, not forgetting the responsibility, and the responsibility indeed of both sides, to the future. The past is always there, but I think that the great success of German-Israeli military cooperation and intelligence cooperation was that people were able to overcome the past, not forget, not forgive, but try to first and foremost be concerned with current and future kind of threats. And therefore, I think that as long as these threats do not go away, and anyone who looks at Paris, anyone who looks at Brussels in recent days sees that the threats in Europe as well as in the Middle East are not going to go away, certainly not in our lifetime, can imagine the importance of this cooperation for both sides. Thank you very much.